With its multiple six-figure and ultimately multiple seven-figure compensation levels, it's easy to understand why many folks want to work in private equity. But it's also worth stating that this is an incredibly competitive field to get into, and today I'm going to talk through the top 4 paths to break into this field. So starting with number 4, breaking into private equity without any prior investment banking or top-tier strategy consulting background. Now, if you're in the large majority of folks who didn't work in investment banking or a top-tier strategy consulting role, I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is you're not alone. The bad news is that this is one of the hardest ways to break into private equity because most firms require prior experience in investment banking, and to a lesser degree, they'll also take folks from top-tier strategy consulting roles. With that said, I have seen folks break into the private equity field without prior banking or strategy consulting experience when they have some level of experience in the past working through M&A transactions. Maybe it's through a corporate finance role where they had some exposure to M&A and they've built relationships and they can talk with folks and kind of network their way in. Or if they have significant industry expertise that they can lend to the private equity firm. So let's say that you're a healthcare executive, you can join a private equity firm and bring your healthcare experience and hopefully your Rolodex along with you. And then finally, if you've founded a company and ultimately sold it and have had some success with that, private equity firms are always looking for successful executives. And they'll bring you in, and ultimately you either become a deal professional or what's called an operating partner, where you really work with a private equity firm advising on certain deals and get a cut of those deals in most cases, and then sometimes go run those companies. Now, moving on to number 3 here, if you're at a top tier MBA program and you have prior banking experience, there's also often a path in. And the advantage you have in this particular situation is that you have some prior banking experience and you can at least make the case that you can contribute to modeling and digging into businesses because you have that baseline skill set. Even with that skill set, though, it's really tricky because you have to convince folks that you can be an investor when you haven't been an investor in the past. And so while I have seen this work out, this is not a super common path, but it is possible. Now moving on to number 2, you can also recruit for private equity out of undergrad directly. And it's important to understand that this career path has changed quite a lot in the last 10 years. So 10 years ago, there were a handful of private equity analyst opportunities, but that role has grown exponentially as buy-side firms have sought to recruit talent directly out of college. And so if you are aiming for this career path, it is possible, but it's important to understand that there are very few spots for these roles. There aren't a ton of spots. Most firms will hire a small handful of folks and sometimes just 1 or 2. And the expectations are super high. I actually train private equity analysts every summer, and I can tell you that these are some of the most talented folks that I've encountered coming out of undergrad from really business, engineering, pick your major. These are just really, really talented kids. So if you want to go this route, it's important to understand that there is a path, but it's incredibly competitive. And now finally, we get to number 1, the most common approach here, which is breaking into private equity out of investment banking or a top tier strategy consulting role at a firm like a Bain or a McKinsey or a BCG. Now, with this particular path, there's a very structured route here where you work with recruiters who recruit on behalf of the private equity firms, and you interview through 1 or usually multiple rounds. And through this process, you secure an offer with a private equity firm. And the private equity firms tend to prefer this approach, or at least they have historically, because when folks have worked for a couple of years in these firms, particularly in banking, they gain experience that's directly applicable to the job in private equity so people can really hit the ground running. Now, it's important to understand that the timing of the recruiting process for this particular path has changed quite a lot over time. When I recruited for private equity out of investment banking, you typically would work for a year in investment banking, and then you would recruit, and then you would start in investment banking a year later, which was still pretty early. But that whole process has been competed back so that you're recruiting for private equity roles right at the time you join the investment bank to start. Sometimes even in training, you'll hear of folks getting recruited out of training. And it's important to understand that you still go to the bank and you work for 2 years and ultimately join the PE fund. But this whole cycle has become a little bit crazy, and that recruiting of folks right out of undergrad is what we refer to now as on cycle. And then any recruiting that happens after that is what's referred to as off cycle. And what you end up with is just a bunch of scattered recruiting over the course of the year. And there's particularly pronounced pockets, usually in January and February of every year, where there's quite a bit of recruiting. But in short, if you're aiming for investment banking, the most common path here is this final path, which is coming into this role out of investment banking or a top-tier strategy consulting program.